Do you ever put your laundry in and then just forget about it for like 6 hours? In high school, I was one of those people who thought themselves like too good for YA books. So I read a lot of Stephen King. You know, he has like so many books and they tended to be like edgier. I liked walking around carrying, you know, like my 1,000-page copy of It, with like all the like gory, bloody scenes in it, because that's what makes a 14-year-old cool. But it's been a while since I've read anything from him. So that brings us to Full Dark No Stars. This is a collection of 4 suspenseful short stories that all have to do with themes of like revenge or redemption. I have a lot of issues with this book. Unfortunately, I was not able to relive my high school passion for his writing. My biggest issue is probably that most of these stories, they're trying to be like really edgy, but at the same time, I found them to be extremely predictable. At points that were like pushing boundaries a little bit, it really felt to me more, it felt very eye-roll worthy, because it felt more like gratuitous than anything else. The first and best of these short stories is 1922. Wilfred, a farmer, coerces his teenage son into helping him murder his scheming wife so that the two of them can remain on the farm, but it backfires when she comes back from the dead to haunt them, or maybe it's all just karma. Aside from his vivid descriptions of like the horror and gore, which has always been a selling point of his books for me, the story is like totally fine. Like it's just very fine. The best part of this entire book, not just this one short story, was the fun twist at the end of this one, but it's still not worth reading the rest of the 532 pages. And that's because of the second short story in this called Big Driver. Nothing can ever make me read that story like ever again. So it's a rape revenge story about this woman named Tess. She's a writer and she's a very, you know, small woman who gets raped by this like giant trucker stranger man. And the whole thing just feels like so juvenile. I really got the impression that Mr. King got the idea for this story after hearing about the statistic that most rapes do go unreported, but then he just like did not look into like at all why that actually is the case. Reading it all, reading it, every single page just made me so mad because just the way that, just everything that was happening, oh good lord. So obviously she doesn't report the crime. There are literal parts where she's just like, I know that I should, and like I'm going to, but then she stops because she thinks, but what will be in it for me? Like, bitch, that's just so fake. It's so fake. Yo, I got riled up at this story. Like, for real. I had so many issues, clearly. The only reason why I finished it is because I could not believe that it was being played so straight. I kept waiting for, like, this twist to come that just never did. Rape revenge stories as a concept, I think, when it's not, like, done well, it just feels super gratuitous, which, you know, I mean, I guess I'm offended, but it's more like, but why did you do this? Like, what is anyone gonna get out of this? I say that it's not worth talking about, and then, like, I just get, like, mad about it. I actively didn't write down a lot about this one because I didn't want to talk about it. So we're gonna move on. Fair Extension, despite being the shortest story in this bunch, still felt way too long. A man with terminal cancer and 6 months to live meets a mysterious salesperson on the side of the road who sells extensions of any sort. Hair extensions, dead extensions, life extensions. The catch is our main character named Streeter has to transfer his negative energy off to someone else, and it has to be someone he hates. And the person he hates happens to be his wildly successful best friend since childhood, Tom. It's an interesting premise, but it just doesn't go anywhere. And even though it's only like 50 pages, a lot of it is just like the same thing over and over, because after a certain point, like, we've kind of arrived at like a dead end with it. So he makes the trade, obviously, it works. And then, you know, for the rest of the 50 pages, it's basically just straight up misery porn. Like, we just watch Tom's life fall completely apart in every conceivable way, while Streeter looks on sadistically, like, enjoying it. So is this a story about how karma eventually catches up to all of us? No, because based on what we're given, Streeter just comes across as kind of like wrongfully bitter and jealous of Tom. So is it about how life can be unfair for like absolutely no reason? Because at one point Tom does even bring up like the Book of Job. But no, it's not about that either, because Streeter like actively chooses to screw him over. So is it about how when it comes down to it, you would do anything to save your own life? Not really, because Streeter specifically has to choose someone that he hates, and then doesn't really seem that torn up about it. It feels like there's supposed to be like something of substance there, but anything I come up with just feels so emo and like negative about the general human condition, which is just kind of like lame and disappointing. Like, I get that like this is Stephen King and he's most well known for his horror, but also does like suspense and whatever, and doesn't like to be pinned down, but in general he, you know, doesn't write happy stuff. There's a difference between something that's like not profoundly sad, but like tragic with something to it. There's a difference between that and something that's just like miserable just to be miserable. You could also say that like this story really doesn't have a theme and it's just about this guy, in which case like I literally can't argue with that. That might be true, so then I guess it's just my fault for wasting my time on it. And finally, we reached the last story, titled A Good Marriage. At this point, I'm so disillusioned with the rest of the collection that I'm like not even reading it to give it a chance. I'm just reading it to just finish the book. Like, as soon as I saw the title for this, I was like, let me guess, it's about a bad marriage. Darcy has been married to and content with her coin-collecting husband for close to 2 decades, when one day she suddenly stumbles upon his collection of BDSM magazines and finds proof that he's a serial killer. He tells her that the evidence she found was from his very, very last victim, and he's gonna stop for her. He promises, like, no more. He's going cold turkey, and they end up continuing their facade of a good marriage, or is it a facade? Yeah, it is, because she ends up killing him at the end. And then a third character who was like briefly mentioned offhand earlier in the story suddenly shows up and tells her that what she did was completely justified. That was good that that happened before she could feel too torn up about it. Fair Extension at least sent me on a trip thinking that like there was something more to it, but this one I like really don't have anything to say. Like, that's it. You think you know a guy and you don't, and then you can kill him and it's fine. One constant in his stories, like I guess from his style of writing, that really started to irritate me after the same thing happened 4 times over, is that his main characters always have some kind of like internal, external like voice that tells them things that they would have like absolutely no way of finding out. It just feels incredibly lazy. Like in 1922, Wilfred had his dead wife who tells him all about like how his son is gonna die before it happens, and then in Big Driver, Tess has both her GPS and her cat who like slip her little clues about like who her who the truck driver's identity is, and then she acts like surprised, like she knows, she's just like, oh, like I project these voices onto them, you know, it just helps me think, and then they'll like say something and then she'll be like, what did you say? But then it's not like a thing, it's just very like just a little irritating. And they always turn out to be right. Whatever these characters say, like, they just always turn out to be right. And this is something that he does in his novels too, but I just don't think it ever really either like didn't notice or it didn't really bother me so much until like after reading like 4 stories in a row with supposedly different characters, when like I kind of realized like, oh, this is like the only character that he can write from the perspective of. You can really tell that like he, you know, pretty famously doesn't plan out his stories and he just like writes. And it's so obvious when he like writes himself into a corner and then the only way to get out of it is to just have the character suddenly know something. And then it also, the characters all have like this kind of snarky attitude. I think that this plays into partly, like to go back to what I said in the beginning of the video, like the reason I read a lot of like Stephen King in high school aside from the content of his novels, is that they were just so easy to read. Like they flow very well off the page, you can read them very quickly, but like they're all kind of snarky and they just, the jokes that he writes in it feels like something that he found funny at the time, but emotionally it doesn't work. I think it's interesting as well that the 2 stories with the guy protagonists, they like actively chose to do something and then the story is about like the repercussions of that. Whereas the 2 with the girl protagonists, something happens like to them and then like it's about how like they react to it. That's not like a reading on like his body of work as a whole, like at all, but I think that it's a pattern that I've noticed just in like media in general. So yeah, is this worth reading? No. I give it a full dark no stars out of 5 stars. It's just, you know, he's written so much, and I think that there's a reason why books like, you know, The Shining and Misery and like It are so much more popular and like actually well known. And it's because he's actually good at writing like horror and coming up with like, you know, the wacky ideas, regardless of if he was, you know, on drugs while he was doing it. He's actually good at that as opposed to like the very heavy-handed, like grounded dramas, I guess, that he's trying to do in this book. Like I hadn't heard of any of these before reading this, and like I guess there's a reason for that. Although I did find out that like 1922 I think is a Netflix movie or is a movie on Netflix, and my like, you know, best praise about this book is that if someone was like, hey, do you want to watch this with me, I would be like, yeah, sure, I guess. Sounds fine. And you know what really gets my goat? In the afterword, it literally starts with, the stories in this book are harsh. You may have found them hard to read in places. If so, be assured that I found them equally hard to write in places. Like, alright. That just comes across as very like, oh, like, sorry if it was like a little too edgy for you to be into. My problem isn't that it was too harsh. It was that, like, it was like only harsh and like nothing else. Alright? Like, get out of here. When I read this, I didn't think I'd get so riled up about it. I actually finished reading this like a couple weeks ago, and I thought I was over it. But that's literature for you. So thanks for watching. I'll see you on a different day for a different review. Bye. Yo, I love this house and my roommates are great, but just in terms of filming, I'm so excited to like move out and like not be like, I don't know if they can hear me in the kitchen. I'm just like embarrassed every time I film.